Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome to the second day of the COP26 conference on behalf of the Supergen hubs. I'm just going to, conscious this is a 9 a.m. start, so I'm just going to give it a moment for people to join us and fill you in on some background while you join. We are recording this meeting and we will make the recording and where the presenters have allowed the slides available afterwards. And to let you know that this meeting has been organised by Dan Taylor from the Supergen Bioenergy Hub on behalf of all of the hubs, because we think it's really important that we come together to share our learning and our research in the run-up to the very important COP meeting that's happening in Glasgow and Italy next month. So I want to start this morning by giving you an introduction to the Supergen Bioenergy Hub. I hope you can see my slides at the moment.
We can't see your slides.
No,
Tricia,
I've temporarily lost my slides. Let me just share them again.
And Sam, you might want to turn your camera off.
Okay, that should be it now. Okay, so without further ado, moving into the bioenergy session this morning, I think it's worthwhile just reflecting on the role that bioenergy already plays in the UK energy system. And on this graph, you can see the progress that has been made since 1990. When the Rio Earth Summit was held and the declaration made that we were actually serious about doing something about climate change. And you can see a particular focus here on bioelectricity in the bottom, which still in 2019 was outpacing all other forms of renewable electricity. That reached roughly parity last year. Beyond that, you can then see in the heating sector that bioheat massively outstrips all other forms of heating, and indeed the same is true in transport. And it's interesting that just this week we've seen a lot of public discourse around the difference between E5 and E10. The role of bio in many ways goes unnoticed until someone mentions it. So, you know, E5 had happened for a long time, no one talked about it, and now suddenly people are asking, do consumers know what E10 is? So I find that interesting that we can actually get this far in terms of penetration with practically no one noticing. The issue, of course, is that to get further, we have to look at different technologies, different implementation mechanisms. And really, I feel as responsible researchers, we need to be bringing the community along with us, sharing what we're doing and raising public awareness about these issues. So if I look at what's been happening in bioenergy, you've just seen the data. When we set out on the Supergen Bioenergy Hub, we thought that what we would be looking at in the near term is the use of biomass for flexible heat and power, with a focus around bringing new feedstocks in, a focus on pollutants, a need for materials for higher steam conditions and other issues within the conversion system, a focus on ecosystem benefit, circular economy, and a need to look at better pretreatment. I think all of those have held true, with the possible exception of diversity of feedstocks. I don't think we have much moved away from the wood pellets that are so controversial at times, and perhaps waste feedstocks. We thought that in the medium term, we would be looking at fungible hydrocarbons and that the role of catalysis would be important. I believe that's still the case. I think that the aviation sector in particular is absolutely key here. And there is a really urgent need to look at aviation and to look at the most efficient ways that will deliver real carbon reductions in that sector, not methods of providing fuel that suits the airline at any environmental cost, which I fear we might head down at some point. And in the longer term, we thought we would be looking at gaseous vectors, hydrogen in particular, and routes from biomass and waste via gasification and AD. I think the surprise there has been that that has accelerated much quicker than I perhaps would have anticipated at the outset of Supergen. And that's been great because we've been able to get involved with many of the real projects that are happening on the ground here and help inform those. So how have we done that? We divide ourselves into an entire bioenergy system, and bioenergy is different to many of the other energy systems that you will see on models and that you will see throughout this conference, because we have a physical resource. And the implications of that are incredibly important. So we have an entire topic group on resources. They will be presenting this morning. We have one on pretreatment and conversion. We have one on vectors. That's what we turn the bio into. Is it a gas? Is it a liquid? Is it electricity? And then we look at topic group 4, integrating that all together as a system, because if we don't line those up neatly alongside each other, we will not get the best efficiency and the best carbon reductions that we can. We integrate that via realistic case studies, and those are progressing at pace at the moment, with some information, if you look on our website, on the specific areas that we're looking at around heat, around hydrogen, and around waste, aviation fuels, and several others. So if you are coming from that side and you want to see how your work can best fit with Supergen, please do have a look at the case studies. But most of all, I think what we have done in the last few years is we have delivered impact. We have worked incredibly closely with government departments, with industrial partners, and with the wider research community via our early career researchers, to show the difference that bioenergy can make, to improve understanding and to improve take-up of the options in the long term. It's about translating all of the detail that you are about to hear from our specialists in these areas into what does this mean for me as a consumer? What does this mean for me as a developer and for me as a policymaker? So that's what the mission of Supergen is. We're sitting at the moment at home mostly. Dan, I think, may be in the office, but we are led from Aston University, and you have my email address there should you wish to make contact with us after this. But without further ado, I am going to pass on to the first of our presentations from our topic groups, which is on resources, please.
So good morning. So thank you, Patricia. So my name's Ian Donison, and I lead topic group 1 on resources. And I'm just going to share my slides. Nothing appeared yet.
Not yet.
I'll share them for you, Ian, if you wish. Okay.
Yeah, no, okay, thanks. Do that then.
I can see
Brilliant,
those now.
thank you. That's great. Yeah, no, I can see that. Thank you, Dan. Okay, so topic group 1. So I'm going to talk about some of the work that 3 of us in particular involved in topic group 1 are doing. So myself, Rebecca Rowe, who's at the UK Centre of Ecology and Hydrology in Lancaster, and also Naveed Arshad, who's working with myself and Rebecca. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Dan. So one of the other challenges, I guess, we have with biomass, and also in effect one of its real strengths, is the fact that biomass has multiple uses. But a big question around that then becomes, is there enough for all those potential uses? particularly if different sectors are considering the overall biomass availability. So biomass, I guess, particularly in relation to the sort of traditional areas of Supergen, has been very much associated with heat and power, and also really with transport fuels, including now obviously for aviation as well, being a particular area. So biomass really being the sort of closest analog really to fossil fuels, not surprisingly, really, in the sense that fossil fuels really are just ancient biomass, in the fact that you have a material that you can store and then convert to sort of traditional forms of energy. It also represents a resource that you can convert into platform chemicals, also a source of fibers for going into construction and other forms of green manufacturing, and also really importantly, it can, in terms of as a crop, when it's being grown, provide ecosystem services, including a number of quite important ones in terms of soil carbon sequestration, so we can get additional carbon benefits, and also in terms of broader services such as flood mitigation, and also aspects of biodiversity as well. Now, the sort of biomass availability is something that we've been looking at, particularly from a policy perspective. And at the bottom, there's a report that was produced from a number of the Supergen authors to, in fact, the Department of Transport, but was also very much involved in discussions with BAYS and DEFRA as well. So next slide, please, Dan. So work we're really doing in Supergen is really around mapping sort of land availability, but particularly marginality and the opportunities of production of bioenergy crops. So one of the sort of traditional concerns of bioenergy crops is conflicts with or potential conflicts with other forms of land use, and therefore really trying to consider, well, how do we potentially map on biomass productivity to the land that's available, and particularly land that isn't really suited particularly to primary food production, or where there are various aspects of marginality that come in. So we're doing work very much around looking at the ways that different ways that land marginality can be defined, and then looking at opportunity maps for bioenergy crops, and particularly how they can map onto those different marginalities for the UK. And in terms of that productivity, we're looking at how we can really optimize biomass productivity by looking at particularly aspects of current climates, variation in climate of the seasons, again, some of those things that are driving marginality, how those are going to change in the future, particularly around extreme weather events, and also particularly thinking about that establishment phase, because that's really getting through that sort of first year where the plants are quite small. These are often perennial systems that we're looking at, and that's really where the marginality of the site can probably be have the greatest impact. So next slide, please, Dan. Okay, so the other aspect that's really important when we're doing this is around the environmental impacts of land use change, so to and from bioenergy crops. So again, this is really interesting, really an area of interest from a policy perspective, but also by industry, because this really does often drive those social and environmental licenses to operate. So we've been involved in a number of projects through the current and actually last Supergen as well, and particularly looking around the overall greenhouse gas impacts of transition from one crop type in so either arable or grassland into bioenergy cropping. So looking at particularly the impacts on carbon dioxide, also around other greenhouse gases, so particularly nitrous oxide in an agricultural context. This happens with other forms of land use transition, movement from one crop to another, but particularly looking at in this context and then trying to compare that to other systems. Also impacts on hydrology. And again, a big part of what we're looking at as well is really understanding those additional carbon sequestration potential benefits and opportunities to improve soil health by growing these bioenergy crops, so long-term, potentially 10, 20-year perennial biomass crops through the additional carbon sequestration, and been particularly looking at leaf litter inputs, where we've actually seen differences in the sort of plant genetics, and therefore there's an opportunity, we believe, for plant breeding in the future for actually optimizing additional carbon sequestration in the soil from selection of certain varieties. And there's a list of a number of the sort of paper outputs we've had from some of the Supergen work that we've been doing in that area. So Dan,
50, can we?
Yep, thanks. So last slide now, thanks. Right, thanks. So just finally, just saying, a number of us involved in the Supergen Bioenergy Hub are involved in one of the new greenhouse gas removal demonstrators that's very much looking at how do we upscale these crops. So how do we go from an area at the moment of probably about 10 to 12,000 hectares of these crops to something that's in the number of tens of thousands over the next number of years. And as we do that, how do we look at those social and environmental impacts of doing that? And at that, I'll leave it and pass on to the next speaker.
Okay, thank you. And the next speaker is Jason Hallett from Imperial College, who is going to give us a rundown on what has been going on in topic group 2, Pretreatment and Conversion. Jason's going to do most of the presentation, and then we will switch over to Nathan Skillen from Queen's University in Belfast. Over to you, Jason.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Patricia. I apologize, I think my camera's winking in and out, but hopefully we'll make it through this. So as Patricia said, talking a bit about topic group 2, which is the pretreatment and conversion part of the Supergen Bioenergy Hub, which the PIs involved are myself and Tony Bridgewater from Aston and Chris Hardacre from Manchester. But as Patricia said, Nathan's going to talk about Chris's part in a moment. I'm going to focus a bit on enabling technologies. So Tony and I mostly work on things that are upstream. So we take in biomass post-cultivation, so after Ian's handed it off, and try and prepare it for its end use. And this sort of topic group 2 is a little bit all-encompassing in the sense that we look at a lot of different conversion technologies, everything from thermochemical, biochemical, and chemocatalytic technologies within this. As I mentioned, Tony in particular looks at thermochemical transformations of biomass. This is an example of some recent work from Scott Banks in his lab at basically the amount of bio-oil that can be prepared through thermochemical biomass conversion as a function of potassium levels in the biomass. This is quite interesting because you see a catalytic effect from ions that are taken up naturally by the plant. And so if you manipulate the amount of potassium, presumably in the soil, and the amount that the crop takes up during its growth cycle, then you can increase the liquid yield during pyrolytic conversion of the wood chips afterwards. This is quite an interesting opportunity for a lot of sort of high-end liquid biofuels. Sustainable aviation fuel would be the one that's most topical at the moment, because you can, the higher the organic liquid yield, the higher the amount of biofuel that you can produce. In my case, we work on, I guess, a more chemical pretreatment of biomass, specifically using ionic liquids in order to extract lignin from biomass to produce cellulose. And that fits in most notably into second generation biofuels, so things like bioethanol production from energy crops or waste wood. And the technology that we developed at Imperial College, which is now being commercialized by a company named Lixia, which we spun out and is working at pilot scale in Sweden, looks at the production of specifically C6 sugars from different types of biomass. So we take in waste biomass and we isolate cellulose, and then that cellulose can be hydrolyzed to glucose, which could be fermented later on. The big selling point of our technology is that it is very intensified because it's a chemical process. We can run very high solids loadings and very short treatment times, and that leads to a very low cost product. And in our case, the glucose can be produced at a lower price than the current selling price of food sugar, which is quite exciting. The last thing that I wanted to talk about a bit today is technology translation. And when we were discussing, what could we do in 5 minutes, I thought rather than just give you a technical overview of all the wonderful and exciting things that we do with ionic liquids, I thought it'd be more interesting to talk a bit about what I have experienced in tech translation between academia and industry, especially in the UK context. So far in the last 4 years, my research group has spun up 6 companies, 5 of which are operating in the, I guess you could say, in the bioeconomy or the circular economy, really. So 4 of them take in biomass as a primary feedstock. It's quite an interesting environment at the moment for SMEs in the UK. So as I mentioned, we've spun out 6 companies from Imperial College. 2 of them have actually moved out of the UK in the last 2 years, and 3 more are discussing it quite openly. And as much as one of them was definitely a casualty of Brexit, because we had a very large European grant, and so we kind of had to move to Europe in order to maintain our working facility in Sweden. But the others actually has very, very little to do with that. It's more about the current investment culture within the UK. And I think biorefining is a particularly interesting case study because it's a very universal technology, which means you can do it just about anywhere. And so logically, the best place to start up a company in the biorefining sector is wherever you find the most promising economic environment, because very likely you're going to have crops nearby. And the investment de-risking in the UK at the moment is quite a bit behind both the US and Europe. And specifically in biorefining is not underpinned by a very strong commercial infrastructure. And by that, I basically mean we don't have any pulp mills in the country. And so that sort of puts us on a poor footing to begin with. So we're starting from kind of a bad position, and we don't have a lot of de-risking opportunities either from the government or industry in order to support scale up and translation of technologies into full-scale commercial use. Historically,
Jason, and you've got Nathan to go as well.
Yeah, we're done in now, actually. So I guess all I was going to say is historically we excel at innovation, but we're quite a bit behind on translation, and I think that that's something, a gap that we need to fill in the future. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, so Nathan, are you going to pick up from there, please?
Yeah, I do. I can share my slides off this. Hopefully that should be showing at the moment.
We can see that on the screen.
Perfect, thanks very much. So I'm going to cover some of the other work that we do in topic group 2, which is around photocatalytic biomass reforming. So I guess this is one of the newer conversion technologies that's come through, especially in the bioenergy sector. And as the name suggests, it's essentially light-driven chemical reactions. So we use different types of light to drive a catalytic reaction. And in the last 5 years, the field has started doing that more for bioenergy to generate not just energy itself, but to also generate value-added compounds as well. So that's what we refer to as photoreforming. So the diagram in the middle gives you an indication of the mechanism, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about, but the 2 key reactions are a reduction reaction and an oxidation reaction. Now, the reason that they're important is because it gives us the potential to actually simultaneously generate energy and value-added compounds. Now, as a little bit of context, the field itself only really started in the 70s. And like I said, in the past 5 years, photoreforming of biomass has come through quite strongly, but it's come through really strongly in a big way. And it's got a lot of sort of potential, and it's really emerging as sort of a hot topic at the moment. And the reason for that is because there is actually a lot of benefits to photocatalysis. Now, it is a slightly lower end TRL in terms of technology readiness, but the potential of it is around the energy. So if we compare it to some of the other conversion technologies out at the moment, it only actually needs light as that major input. We don't need any temperature and we don't need any pressure. So we operate under ambient conditions. Of course, it's light driven. That means there is the option to have direct solar activation. And it's actually been proven to be feasible for this technology and to produce energy from biomass as well. Sorry. So if you couple photocatalysis with direct solar, you've obviously got a very sustainable and potentially low carbon technology, which is very nice. The other added benefits are one of the most active catalysts is TiO2. It's very commercial, it's very cheap, it's very safe as well. It doesn't generate a lot of byproducts. So the way that we sort of work that into some of our research is we look at it in terms of hydrogen generation with a view towards could it be localized distributed hydrogen. We also look at waste stream valorization as well. So can we generate value-added products from some of the feedstocks that we're using? And we have the added benefit of using a wide range of feedstocks. Photocatalysis is relatively non-selective, which means it will attack whatever's in its vicinity. So there are a lot of positives. There are also challenges there as well, but the challenges kind of help us shape our research, and it also helps us target what we think is important to drive that field further forward and continue to see that development. So I've put two key examples of some of the research we're doing at the moment. So looking at pretreatment and lignin linkages as well. So in terms of pretreatment, what we try to do is improve the reactivity of some of the materials that we're starting with. So we can use food waste, we can use agricultural residues, and we can use energy crops. What's important for us is trying to get them as reactive as possible. So some of my colleagues in Manchester have looked at pretreatments, including ball milling and chemical pretreatments as well. And we found that we can increase the hydrogen that we get as we lower the crystallinity and as we lower the amorphous regions of the material as well. And that's a huge step for us as well, because it shows that with some simple pretreatments, we do get higher yields of products. The other side is looking at the fundamentals. So part of being able to facilitate the development of this technology is really understanding what happens on a chemical level. And the way that we've done that is looking at lignin linkages, very specific linkages. The compound is very complicated. So what we've done is been able to synthesize key parts of that compound and look at what happens when we apply photocatalysis. So we can understand which of these linkages are actually going to break down. It also helps us understand which ones we're going to struggle with. And that can help us identify within the structure what value-added compounds we could get out as well. So this is just two examples of what we do, but everything we have done within our research, it gives us a much better insight into sort of photocatalytic photoreforming, and that kind of helps us take the technology a little bit further forward. I'm hoping, and within time, Patricia hasn't stopped me yet, so I will end it there.
I'll let you keep running because it was interesting, Nathan, but we are slightly over. So let's move on to Sam Cooper, please, from University of Bath on vectors.
Hi, yes, is that sharing okay?
It is indeed. Thank you, Sam.
Awesome. Yeah, so hi, I'm Sam. So we're looking at energy vectors as our theme. So why are we interested in that? Well, I mean, I'm focusing on greenhouse gas emissions, but I guess it applies to any sort of impact category. We've got these three stages: the resources, the pre-treatment, conversion that you've just heard about, and between them, these two give a good indication of the impacts of a system up to the point in which we deliver it. So sort of land use change, maybe related to resources, biogenic flows, sort of energy inputs, process emissions, and so on. But if we want to have a sort of an overview, a complete picture of their impact, we need to think about the actual use of them. So how they're used, but also what's being displaced, what would have otherwise been used and is no longer used because we've got this bioenergy. And so really, the point really that I'm just trying to get across is that we need to think about the benefit of displacing these counterfactual energy vectors, the ones which otherwise we'd be using. And this is fairly simple in principle, but it varies with time and location, so it can be a bit complicated. So a classic example here is where we have the electricity grid. It's rapidly being decarbonised, and so the benefit of displacing electricity is changing, and this can change both with time, as I say, and also with location. So I'm just going to give a couple of sort of quick examples of this, sort of hammer home the point, but also to give a flavour of some of the other bits of work which we're doing in case it's interesting and you want to sort of touch base with us about this. So the first one, so here we were doing some analysis of a commercial sort of AD operator that is near to us here in Bath. And they produce electricity with a CHP plant. So first of all, we were just looking at sort of what's their greenhouse gas emissions balance. So there's a few sort of sources of emissions, and then in the sort of the framing of this, we're looking at sort of what's the avoided emissions due to avoided fertilizer manufacture, landfill, and grid electricity. So in other sort of framings, you might need to allocate this differently or whatever. But so essentially there, we would say, well, there's a benefit of a couple of thousand tons of CO2 equivalent per year due to the site. What's then interesting, though, is if we think, well, what would happen if rather than producing electricity, they use all of their biogas, they refine it and use it to sort of inject into the grid as biomethane. And here we have similar actual emissions, but the avoided emissions due to that biomethane are much greater. And so the overall benefit is more than doubled. So it's getting on to 5,000 tons CO2 equivalent per year saved. And there's really two reasons for that. First is, as I say, the grid intensity. So in this case of the electricity grid, that's decreasing. So that's a key factor. And the second is the sort of the energy efficiency. So it's much more efficient to produce biomethane from the biogas because you're really just refining it than actually generating electricity. But actually, there's a third aspect which this highlights as well, which is that we have this this biogas, this CO2 in the biogas. When we're producing biomethane, it's already split out, and so that really facilitates the idea that in the future, if there's the infrastructure and the sort of commercial environment for it, that could be sequestered or stored, and that would actually further increase the saving to about 7,000 tons. So it's more than tripling the original sort of benefit. So it's really these three aspects which we think are kind of key. So next example, very quickly, biomass gasification. So here we could have sort of biomass waste being gasified to a syngas, and then that could be further processed to either hydrogen, burnt to generate electricity, or there could be other things which get more complicated, but just focusing on hydrogen or electricity. So we're having a look at it, and these are a couple of good studies on sort of just the specifics, like basically the first two steps, the resources and the actual processing. And here, for example, they would have so both of them are very impressive in terms of having negative emissions, so that's a good thing, and the electricity generation looks more negative, so better. If we were to normalize it instead of per kilowatt hour of electricity generated in terms of the actual biomass energy input, then they become pretty similar. You can see there, there's not much in it because the electricity generation is less efficient than the hydrogen production. But then when we think, well, what does it actually replace? And again, blue hydrogen, there's lots of studies which will vary a bit, largely depending upon the fugitive emissions that they assume. But there's a good range of maybe sort of 60 to 120 there. And so we look at, well, if we're displacing that or we're displacing electricity, well, how does that look? And what we've done here is, so the black lines there so relate to these figures. Whereas we've got, and then these other lines are looking at sort of Bayes projections of, so Green Book projections of electricity. These have then been adjusted relating to the efficiency. So it's the sort of the amount to be displaced. And we can see really in the next sort of four.
Can we get to the conclusion, Sam, please? Sorry.
We can. Then actually the benefit of hydrogen is much better. So conclusions, we need to look at what is the benefit of displacing the other things. There's a few factors: efficiency, the intensity of the counterfactual, and other synergies. And we'd be really happy if any of those examples are of interest to you to get a bit more in touch and follow up with it.
Brilliant, thank you, Sam. And now the last of the 5-minute presentations, we have Miriam Rodder on systems, who's going to be looking at net zero and sustainability. Over to you, Miriam.
Okay, can you see my slides?
We can, full screen, lovely.
Excellent, that was a smooth transition. I'm impressed with myself to control technology. Brilliant. Okay, So good morning, everyone. I'm Miriam Roda from Aston University, and I lead the topic group systems. And I want to shift the focus a bit from net zero, not totally, but I want to talk actually about sustainability of bioenergy. Have my slides moved?
The slides have disappeared.
Oh, excellent, brilliant. That was all too smooth to kind of like be successful. Let me try again. Sorry. Here we go. Have they come back?
They're there, yeah.
And are they moving? Oh,
Yeah.
no, it tells me. Oh, here we go.
Yes,
Does that-
touch.
Excellent. Okay. So as I said, I want to focus a bit more on sustainability of bioenergy, because we know bioenergy can deliver greenhouse gas emission reductions, and we also know bioenergy is the only renewable energy that actually can deliver net negative emissions through CCS pathways. But bioenergy can deliver so much more than emission reductions and renewable energy, because there are a lot of sustainability benefits for the environment, for the economy, and the society. And because we're interested in a sustainable transition, in the systems group, we have developed a bioenergy sustainable indicator model, which has been developed and designed by Andrew Welfer from the University of Manchester, which is a model which allows us to assess sustainability of a full bioenergy system, looking at the different aspects of sustainability. So it considers the sustainability aspects around people and society. It considers development, what we include technology development, but also economic and infrastructure development. It focuses also on the natural system, so everything around land, water, air, and climate change. And climate change here, we not just mean emission reductions, we also mean policy governance frameworks and, for example, climate justice. Why have we developed another model? Well, the thing about bioenergy is the complexity and the relation to other sectors. And obviously our model allows to assess single indicators of sustainability, and it shows us how different indicators have different impacts. But it also allows us to actually map the relationship between indicators. So we have different indicators with different impacts, but what we're really interested in our research is the relationship between them and how they influence each other. Because depending on the weight and the relationship between the different indicators, that will affect the dynamics within the system. And you usually not just have direct relationships, you also have indirect relationships, which can be quite important. So the model allows us to look at the trade-offs between the benefits and the risks of a bioenergy system, and it allows us to find out what the overall sustainability score is. If we then take these results a step further and look into the system dynamics, it can give us pictures like this here, which is a network analysis. And this allows us to understand which aspects are the most important for the overall sustainability, and what factors actually drive the system, and what makes then the system most resilient. And that not just means bioenergy, but also how bioenergy sits in the wider system, because obviously it has a role in the bigger energy system. It's closely related to agriculture and forestry. So what is actually the role of bioenergy within the wider system in the transition to net zero? This is some work which has been done by Rob Holland from University of Southampton, who's looking particularly into biodiversity. And he is currently looking into the impact of bioenergy on biodiversity beyond borders, I would call it, because he is interested in understand, if we do bioenergy in one country, how does it affect the biodiversity in another country, not just in the country where we do the bioenergy? And he has done some work in the past looking into the wider renewable energy system, which showed that developed economies have a much greater overseas impact on biodiversity on actually their own territories. And what it also showed, which is not too surprising, is that renewables have a lower impact on biodiversity than fossils. But if we transition to net zero and we need to scale up renewable energies, how will that actually affect biodiversity impacts? So the key messages from us here are really, bioenergy is not just about net zero and greenhouse gas emissions, because it can deliver all these additional sustainability benefits. And mapping these benefits or the sustainability as such provides a much deeper understanding than assessing just individual indicators. So it provides a better understanding of just looking at greenhouse gases, just looking at the economy, or just looking at the benefits for society. So understanding system dynamics and the relationship really helps to understand the impacts of different drivers, but also of change. Because if we talk about net zero, that can change sustainability of the whole bioenergy system because we focus on a specific aspect. So we need to consider how does it affect the whole system, but also how does it affect the wider system. So the contextual and whole system mapping is quite key. And this is so important because we're not changing from a status quo to a new endpoint, but we actually have a dynamic transition. Okay, that's for me.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Miriam. I am now going to hand over to Joanna Sparks, who is the Policy Fellow for the Supergen Bioenergy Hub and a range of the BBSRC NIBs, who's going to lead us through the panel discussion. Over to you, Joanna.
Hi everyone. So I'm going to bring back all the presenters who are going to join our panel, and then also we have one additional panel member, Rebecca Rowe, who's involved in topic group 1. So I think we've got everyone back. If you have any additional questions, please pop them in the chat. I think we've already had a couple in there and I have been picking them up. We're going to structure our panel discussion around 3 key discussion themes that have been outlined by UKRI. So the first is greening the economy and society. The second is the future of sustainable transport. And then the third discussion theme will be securing a global transition to clean energy. So when I'm picking questions out the chat, they might seem like they're coming in a random order, but it's because we're trying to stick to those themes roughly so that we can join related things together. So without further ado, I'll get going. So first of all, I think a couple of people touched on this in their presentations, but I wondered if some of you could give us your thoughts on the role that biomass and bioenergy will play in greening the society and economy. And I don't just mean in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, I'm talking about some of these wider benefits. So Miriam touched on sustainability in her final presentation, but some of those wider benefits that bioenergy systems could provide to society.
Do you want me to start?
Go for it, Ian. There's a lot of people on the panel, so you're just going to have to jump in, I think.
So, I mean, I guess, yeah, so I guess it is that there's clearly that key role that biomass can play in terms of, as Miriam was saying, around generating those negative emissions, which is really important for achieving net zero. And that can be both through CCS or making long-lived sort of products and materials that keeps that carbon out of the atmosphere. But obviously, as you're growing those crops, there is that opportunity for those broader benefits. I mentioned some of those. You know, there's around the soil carbon. There's potentially around flood mitigation. These are often perennial crops, standing over the winter, so opportunity to capture potentially nutrients. And also soils, and they are used in those kind of areas, particularly some sort of areas in Italy and so on, some of the mountain areas where you've got arable crops. These sort of crops can often fit into those. So I think there's a range of ways that these are, and I think really that what we want within, if you like, an agricultural landscape is a patchwork of different cropping systems. And so these is, you know, in terms of fitting those into something where you have standing crops over the winter, you know, they'll get used by, you know, different, whether that's insects, mammals, birds, and so on, in different ways. So I think it's creating that patchwork of different cropping systems. Anyway, I'll pass on to others.
Okay, maybe I jump in here. I think when we talk greening the economy, we also need to think about how we change the job sector, the skills sector, and get the society actually involved in not just using energy, but also participating in producing energy. And especially bioenergy offers a lot of opportunities also for decentralized and off-grid systems, which not just allows easier energy access, but also participation along the supply chain for different actors. And I think that's a really big opportunity, because then people can can learn not just kind of like how to switch on the light, but actually where energy comes from. And that has a really big effect also in being more conscious how we use and how we behave using energy. So I think there's a really big potential, and bioenergy can bring that quite nicely, because you have these really long, complex supply chains. And if it's, to understand how biomass is grown, but also what happens if I just throw my waste into a bin? Where does it go? What happens to it? And what is related to it? So I think there's kind of like the wider societal benefit of opportunities to integrate and include societies. And we work quite a lot also overseas in the Global South, where this in particular has a really big benefit for communities to get involved and participate in the system, while also benefiting from it and also making decisions on what do we actually want to do with it. Is net zero our key focus, or is it about jobs and skills, or is it about education and so on? So I think there are lots of different opportunities.
So I think Rebecca put her hand up first, and then once Rebecca's done, we can go to Jason as well.
So I'm really following on with those societal benefits, and I think from a resources point of view, obviously we're quite linked into sort of the agricultural sector, and there's a great interest for at least farmers in the UK, the potential for bioenergy crops to diversify their income streams, and potentially as a way for them to start to get, not to say rewards, but a wider involvement in environmental protection, which is something that a lot of growers are interested in anyway. And looking at the overseas sort of aspect as well, I think there's a potential, as biomass is potentially got value for ecosystem services as well as producing a crop, you're able to diversify income streams potentially for people in lower middle income countries, which is something that we've done some work on before. And I think there's huge potential there for us to look at bioenergy crops as a way to support the development of those people and to give them, but it needs to be done in the right way. And it's a societal challenge to ensure that the benefits we get as we move to a green economy are shared out more equally than they have been in the past. But there is a huge potential to do that from these systems. So.
I would only add that there's a disconnect, I think, in the green economy or the future green economy. One of the largest and fastest growing sectors of the UK economy at the moment is the bioeconomy, which is, last I saw, was about £240 billion pre-pandemic, and is supposed to double in 10 years. And as far as I can make out, our strategy for doubling that is to double food sugar production, which is quite a daft option in my opinion. So we're gonna increase land use in order to run the bioeconomy rather than decrease it, which is an opportunity that we would have if we switch to lignocellulosic biomass as a feedstock. And so I think further growth worldwide is going to be dependent on that in the materials economy, and even forgetting the energy portion of that, which has a lot of options. I haven't seen anyone really propose an alternative way to make sugar.
Well, just a couple of points also to add on that. So basically, the same as what Jason's saying, I think materials rather than just a focus on energy is going to be a key part of the contribution that this makes. And also in terms of waste treatment, that's going to be a continuing aspect, and one which is potentially economically quite attractive going forwards.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move on to the next question because I feel like we could go on discussing this for ages. So a bit of a switch up, because these are quite technical questions now that we've had come through in the chat. So we had some questions in the chat about the purity of hydrogen from photo reforming, which I think were directed at Nathan, and I know he's already been chatting with some people in the chat function. But one of the questions asked about the purity of hydrogen that can be produced through photo reforming, and looking at some of the impurities that are produced by using other methods that use hydrocarbons. And another one talked about hydrogen separation. So Nathan, if you could pick up those questions, but then also I kind of open it up to Nathan and others if you want to talk about the purity of other liquid or gaseous fuels from biomass and some of the issues or solutions there.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the photocatalysis and the hydrogen purity, I think if I was being really, really honest, nobody in our field has looked at it quite yet, because nobody's produced a high enough concentration of hydrogen to really all of a sudden go, okay, we need to check its purity. A lot of the focus has been on, can we produce it, and can we produce it with ideally a visible light activated catalyst? There's an awful lot of work around that. But if we sort of look beyond that a little bit and the potential, you could have a system that is very, very selective to hydrogen. If you manipulate the chemistry, you manipulate the catalyst, you could have it so that it only really generates hydrogen as a product. That doesn't mean it won't generate potentially CO2. It depends on what the starting feedstock is. There's a lot of chemistry involved there. There's an oxidation and there's a reduction reaction taking place. So it's very easy just to look at the hydrogen, but there definitely will be some CO2. Photocatalysis started as a really environmental remediation process. It's very good at mineralizing, and a lot of people know that when it's mineralized, CO2 is released there as well. So I think in an ideal situation, you're going to have a system that generates a lot of hydrogen, but you'll have CO2 mixed in there as well. So you would need some sort of post-treatment, ideally, that can separate out your hydrogen from probably CO2. But likewise, you can have systems that are generating methane as well, and there's actually some recent work that's looking at methanol as a potential liquid fuel, and it's been very, very selective as well. So that would be, from our side, from a very technical side of the technology, there are challenges there that are coming through a little bit more stronger now, just because, you know, the technology is developed a little bit. I wouldn't say it's one of the main focuses at the moment, but it's, you know, photocatalysis is learning, and it's learning because it's looking around other technologies in biomass that we can't just get the blinkers on and go, yeah, it's really great to produce hydrogen, that there's other challenges there as well. So, you know, it's good to see that, but I think, yeah, there's definitely some thought has to go into what happens after we generate these products, which is why I'm always hesitant about. I do talk about the potential for photocatalysis, but I am fully aware of what challenges lie ahead for us as well, which I guess applies to some of the other technologies as well.
Thanks, Nathan. Does anybody else want to jump in on kind of purity or purification of any of the vectors that we get from biomass? Because if not, I will move on. Yeah, so somebody has asked about hydrogen purification, which I don't know if anybody wants to touch on that. I don't know if anybody here is an expert in that and feels comfortable talking about it, but
it's very hard. There you go.
a good answer. Okay, maybe someone can pick that up with Tim in the chat then. So I am going to stick with hydrogen briefly for another question. So we have one of the things that I can't remember who it was talked about this in their presentation, but they were talking about the fact that one of the benefits of biomass is that it's almost the closest alternative to fossil fuels, because we can produce different vectors and liquid and gaseous fuels that we can store and use for things. But obviously hydrogen is the other alternative for that. Now, whether that's biohydrogen or other hydrogen. So I wondered if anyone could talk about where the roles for hydrogen versus other biofuels might be in the future, and do we see biohydrogen being deployed in the near future, or is that quite far away? So I'm going to maybe direct this at Sam, I think, but I will let anybody pick it up if they want to.
So in terms of deployment, I think there's some really exciting projects already ongoing in terms of hydrogen deployment, and there's various companies involved in that. So you've got sort of the HyNet and other projects there. And then, so I think really, so in terms of biohydrogen, it would be sort of matching in with those projects. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a clear role for us as an energy vector. I mean, initially sort of industry, in terms of its sort of potential greenhouse gas emissions sort of balance, that looks really promising. So I'm not sure there's a whole lot. I mean, I don't really see any question that there is a role for it there in certainly those niches, and then expanding beyond that.
So we'll go Ian and then Miriam as well.
Yeah, so I guess I was really just going to add again, one of those things about biomass is its sort of flexibility, and obviously one way you can divide biomasses into those sort of sometimes wetter, greener biomass types, or the sort of drier, browner types. And again, sort of wastes will fit probably waste can fit in either categories as well. And that clearly those sort of wetter, greener types, you can go down the sort of the sort of fermentation routes to creating hydrogen, those drier types through gasification to producing hydrogen. So again, that sort of flexibility of biomass, there's different routes to getting to those final vectors as well.
Okay, is that okay if I come in, Joanna? Okay.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
So I think obviously the highest temptation around hydrogen is the net negative potential related if we make it from biomass, because then we can capture the CO2, and if we continue with our emission release as we do at the moment, we definitely need it. But then obviously this is one side of the medal. The other side is where does hydrogen make the most sense to use if we have it from biomass, and if we see it in the wider energy system, and where does it bring in the highest benefit in terms of energy, but also other products, and in terms of who can afford it as well. If that is becoming a really expensive energy, for example, who has access to it? How does that actually create a fair, sustainable transition? And I think the discussion around hydrogen is really, really important because of the net negative potential, but it needs to be seen in the wider context of where it's used in the system, in the bioeconomy, and who will be the beneficiaries of it, and how does it then really help us to get to net zero. So I think, and that's the beauty of bioenergy, because it allows you to have so many different options and so much versatility around what you can do with the biomass through the different conversion pathways. And I think hydrogen is important, but if we talk about climate change and sustainable transitions, we need to also see how it sits with other things and where it's used, and if energy use or transport use is then the best way to do it, or put it into other product streams.
So I'm going to ask one more question before we move on to one of our other topics, and that question is going really back to the resources side. So in her introduction, Patricia mentioned those controversial wood chips, and I think they're controversial because people worry that they are an unsustainable source, right? So how do we ensure that the biomass supply that we are using for all these technologies is sustainable wherever it comes from? So I'm guessing we're going to have Rebecca and Ian, but please, again, feel free to jump in, Miriam and others.
Yeah, I think I think this is one of the biggest challenges for biomass, although we have to be realistic. It is one of the most, well, it is, I think there's been a large effort, actually a lot from the end users for certification for biomass. That always has challenges, and there'll always be cases where that certification doesn't work. And we see that with all sorts of resources, not just resources for bioenergy, but you see it for resources for use for other things. But the whole bioenergy industry, I think, in general, is pushing to make this sustainable, because they know if they don't, and if we know if we don't, that there's no point doing this if it's not a sustainable option. It will evolve around, as we're seeing at the moment, international certification systems, monitoring systems. There's technical barriers to overcome for things like when we want to look at carbon sequestration, we need to find rapid ways of measuring soil carbon stock change. There are challenges there, but we can overcome them. And I think there's a desire to do that. And we do have systems in place to start to look at that sustainability. Obviously, in Supergen, we're very much focused on perennial crops because of that environmental benefit. It's not easier, but perennial crops generally have a better environmental balance because of their lower input requirements, and simply because they're not an annual crop that require a huge amount of fertilizer. So again, it's coming back to that crop choice is one of the things, but you need to be careful that you're not ruling out crops that have value in certain areas or in certain applications. So it's crop choice, it's certification, and it's being watched, it's being open to providing data to give people the information they need to make those decisions. I expect Ian's got other things to add to that.
I think you've quite well covered it, I think, Rebecca, and I think it is just understanding those. I mentioned that sort of that social environmental license to operate. I think it's an important part of biomass and understanding those broader impacts of growing the crops. I mean, the reality is that exists for all forms of agriculture. As obviously just sort of bioenergy is sort of in effect. It's newer in the modern world. Obviously, historically, biomass was grown both in terms of as a sort of wood fuel, but also for motive transport, things like oats, other sort of fodder crops for horses and draft animals. So we've done that. It's, I guess, just in the modern age we haven't been growing bioenergy crops, so doing something new. I think there's a lot of sort of examination of what might be the impacts of that. I think we do need to, it is that sort of scrutiny. Okay, well, if we're going to be doing that, and particularly as we're talking about doing that scale up, I think it's that sort of learning by doing element of actually saying, right, as we scale up, because obviously doing things in small areas isn't the same as covering, at field scale, for example. So understanding what happens then in terms of those environmental impacts. It's not the fact they're not necessarily negative, but it is understanding what those changes mean, and also obviously the social components as well.
Yeah, I think following on to that, there is that challenge, isn't there, of scaling down the information we're able to provide, because the impacts, I know there's a question in the thing about waste as well, which I'm sure we'll come on to, but for growing perennial crops, the impacts are actually quite site specific, but it's very difficult to make site specific policy or site specific. It's not impossible, but it's more difficult. And it's us being able to provide that scaled down modeling capability or prediction capability that can work on those smaller scales, but in a policy relevant way. And that's really part of our focus at the moment going forward, is how do we get our research scaled to a position which gives us that level of detail required to predict the impacts at potentially a field scale, because they vary at a field scale, whilst also being policy relevant. And it's a huge challenge, and we're still working on it, but it is something we're looking at. So, and yeah, waste is, we need to use all our biomass as resources in the most efficient way. And we will be, waste is a stream that will potentially have lower impacts, but again, you have to be careful with that waste. And I expect that people like Jason, who've got a lot more experience than I have using waste in systems, will explain some of those technicalities of how you deal with those waste streams.
So I know Miriam and Jason wanted to say something on this, but we had three discussion topics, and we're still on topic one, because we had a lot of questions on that. So can I ask that if you have any kind of points, maybe put them in the chat? And there's also been a couple of extra questions in the chat. One of them was about BECCS. So if somebody feels like picking that up in the chat, that'd be great as well, because I'm going to move on so that we can have at least one question on our last two discussion topics, hopefully. So the second topic we were meant to be looking at is the future of sustainable transport. And I wondered if you could talk, or someone could talk a bit about the role of bioenergy in sustainable transport. So in the short and medium term, what is the role, but also in the long term, and then maybe what are some of the barriers in terms of policy or technologies to actually achieving that? I know some of you know about this. Somebody.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak much about the policy end, but I can talk about sort of the technology end of that. And I think one thing we have to recognize is that changing over a fleet of vehicles takes a while. The estimates I have seen is about 30 years. So if we decide, which we apparently have now decided, that we're going to electric cars, it's going to take 30 years. And there's not much you can do about that, because people don't buy a new car every year. And the percentage of electric vehicles on the road doubled from 2 years ago, from 1% to 2%, which is exciting, but it's going to take a while to perpetuate. And so sort of in the meantime, we're going to have to switch over. And if you look at the upgrading of it, so part of that 30-year problem is also the upgrading of the national grid. So we will have to triple the grid in order to switch over to electrical transport. We'll have to triple it again, incidentally, if we want to switch over to hydrogen from gas. So that's an order of magnitude, a 10 times increase in the capacity of the electrical grid. That is not going to happen in 5 years. So that's a long-term project. And I think in the meantime, one thing that would be nice to de-risk that transition would be if we could take transport out of the equation. And so switching over to a higher percentage of biofuels in transport is very, very easy. The UK is just about dead last in the world in terms of biofuel content in our transport fuels. I'm not just saying that as an American. We're very high. We're second in the world. Thank you very much. But going to 10 or 12% biofuel is a no-brainer. And if a country as environmentally backwards as the US can manage it, I'm pretty sure that the UK can do so also.
Fantastic, thanks, Jason. So then, unless anybody else wants to jump in, I'll move on to the last discussion topic, which is, oh, go on, Sam, sorry.
Just a very quick one.
Want to say something?
Sorry, yeah, I was just going to say, I think also there is this question of timing, and the way ahead is really what makes this whole issue quite complicated, in that there are options which are available in the near term, but perhaps with the exception of aviation fuel, I don't see them as being the long-term optimum uses for bioenergy and biomass. So that is quite a difficult trade-off in terms of how we achieve the scale up, but also the long-term, the picture, which is the best picture there.
I mean, what I wanted to add here is really what I said earlier at the end of my presentation, is that net zero is a transition. We're not jumping from one thing to another. And at the moment, biofuels can play a big role in helping us with this transition, while in the longer term, there might not be the answer, because we might have technology innovation which does not require bioenergy where we would use it now. But especially in kind of like aviation, shipping, biofuels will play quite a big role. And also in terms of, that relates a bit to what we had earlier, the discussion around waste, because there's quite a potential to actually then see it from a waste management point of view, to say, what do we do with specific wastes? And if they can be turned into the transport fuel, for example, why not? So why kind of like exclude things from the equation where there are actually opportunities? And we are in the mess of climate change, and I think we need to use every opportunity, and we should tap into the opportunities we have now. We should do them now while we know they are sustainable in the kind of like in the total, and then see how things develop and where we need to change. So I think sticking to this, okay, by 2050 we need to be net zero, just kind of like sometimes limits your imagination on actually what to do. And I think thinking in smaller steps and taking it step by step, but also enabling innovation, what Jason said earlier about, finance, providing opportunities, allowing more risky technologies and innovations, it's quite important to then see where we are. And obviously we have our understanding of what we can do with bioenergy now, but in 10 years' time, the picture will have changed and we will be at a different point, and then it might require rethinking. So I think it's kind of like do what we can do now and then take it to the next steps and being open-minded. And I think we have Andrew. I don't want to throw you in, Andrew, but I think if you wanted to say something, you have been promoted to presenter as well. And I know you have been working on shipping and looking into transport. So if you wanted to add something, you don't have to, but I just want to flag up, Andrew, you have the opportunity actually to say something.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for that, Miriam. I'm just basically highlighting the massive flexibility of bioenergy, and going back to one of the questions you had before, to add to with sustainability mapping work we've done. I think very often the risks of bioenergy are highlighted as potential barriers, but by mapping the risks and impacts on risks and looking at and weighing them up against each other, you can start to see the wider benefits. If I give an example, the capex or the capital costs of projects are sometimes seen as quite high and problematic, especially in certain parts of the world. But if you map sustainability more generally and you see that bioenergy can provide benefits such as to infrastructure, such as the wider economic sectors, then you can start to look at it in more nuanced. And those potential risks, when stacked against the benefits, are much minimised. So I think you need to look at bioenergy in the rounds, look at all the opportunities it provides in the versatility, in terms of the vectors. And yeah, I think it's something that we need to look at better. We need to map it better and work out how it can fit into and plug into our future demands and future ambitions for energy, chemicals, etc.
Thanks,
Joanne, is there another question you want to get through, or shall we?
I was going to ask one question about low and middle income countries, but I think given that we're at time, if you want, we can probably.
Low middle income countries, please.
Okay. Well, the question was just going to be, why is bioenergy so particularly suited to international development or for use in low and middle income countries? So I know Miriam will probably have something to say on this, but if everyone could keep their answers quite short, because we are already over time. So short and snappy.
I think the big opportunity here is that in many places of the low and middle income countries, biomass is quite abundant and currently not dealt with in a very sustainable way. It's often burned or just disposed. So there's a lot of opportunity to actually tap into these waste streams and at the same time then accelerate energy access for local communities. So there's this really nice interface between a waste problem and an energy problem, which can be solved in one go. That sounds very easy. Obviously, there are barriers and challenges to it. But as Andrew said, understanding the risks and the benefits and understanding that the benefit often can outweigh the risk and might need some financing and support, but there are these opportunities. So I think that, especially in the global south, there's a really high potential for biomass to contribute and allow especially off-grid situations to help people.
I was going to add also, I think that we sometimes lose perspective on what things look like in lower middle income countries. One of my students founded an extraordinary social enterprise that brings electricity to off-grid areas in India. So there's about, there's 900 million people in the world that don't have electrical grids. They don't have access to an electrical grid. So they are doing biomass gasification and solar PVC power, and their competition is not fracked methane. Their competition is a diesel generator. And so the economic advantages of doing bioenergy there are also very high. So the environmental sustainability advantages are nice, but the fact of the matter is there's really no competition. And so putting something in that you can do at a reasonably small scale is quite important when there is no alternative, because the national grid doesn't extend.
Okay. Shall we conclude the panel discussion there then? I just want to very briefly go over what I think we've heard over the last hour. It's been a really stimulating discussion. I hope I will be able to move through this. We started with presentations. I talked about the need to look at the whole system, and then on the resources there was a particular focus on greenhouse gas balances of land use, ecosystem impacts. Our combination of the pre-treatment and conversion topics covered a range of technologies for energy, but also hydrogen, and a big focus on products. And I really like Jason's focus on the fact that the UK doesn't do translation particularly well. This is important given where we sit in the bioeconomy at the moment. The vectors topic focused on the importance of product purity and how the goalposts keep moving with that context of the wider decarbonisation and the product demand and the alternative demand. And then systems, looking at the system dynamics of this. We keep using this term in the Bioenergy Hub, and I do love it, about going beyond boundaries, beyond geographical boundaries, beyond the boundaries where we confine things to products, to energies, to systems. We must always look over the fence, because it's the whole planet that needs to get to net zero, and we need to see that in a wider sustainability context. We then had a wide-ranging panel discussion. We talked about broader ecosystem impacts, societal benefits, jobs, skills, net zero, the bioeconomy. Thank you, Jason. I didn't know it was the fastest growing sector in the UK. That's really useful. And the importance beyond the UK, the low and middle income countries, which I think are absolutely key because they actually have most of the resource and are rapidly urbanising and developing. We talked a lot about hydrogen separation and purification, and I think that is a topic that we should pick up after this COP-focused session. But also the time for the transition, the need for fuels and hydrocarbons because of the existing infrastructure that we have. And let's not forget that near-term carbon reductions are worth so much more in terms of ultimate temperature and climate impact than the ones that we will achieve in 2049 at the last minute before the deadline. In the long term, it's aviation and it's BECCS, and I don't see many people disagreeing with that, a bit of hydrogen thrown in as well. So the transition becomes important, the dynamics and the management, and I think the role of academia here is absolutely key in providing the independent evidence around the impacts of these technologies, but also linking that through to the environmental impacts and the economic performance and charting the pathway on this. So thank you hugely to all of our presenters in this meeting, and thank you also to all of the attendees. I think we topped over 100 people during the course of this. There is, of course, much more going on over the 3 days that we have. I would point you particularly to 12:30 when we have Dr. Alan Whitehead, the Right Honourable Dr. Alan Whitehead MP, giving his perspective on policy and low carbon energy, and perhaps also to the hydrogen and fuel cell session for those who are interested in that side discussion around hydrogen and purification. It is important and it does need tackling, but I think that we are moving in the right direction. So thank you again to all of you for being with us today. The slides will be shared on the Supergen Bioenergy Hub website, and we will also have a number of follow-ups to this session. So please follow Supergen on Twitter, follow us via LinkedIn, and you will keep in touch with everything. Thank you very much.